Hollywood loves a good epic. Sand-swept landscapes, towering temples with priests chanting in mysterious tongues, and armies clashing in a brutal, endless cycle of war. We're given a vision of ancient Mesopotamia as this exotic, violent, and almost alien world. A land of strange rituals and powerful petty gods. But what if I told you that story? The one we all think we know is mostly a mirage. What if the real story is not only more fascinating, but way more relevant to your life? Right now, forget the Hollywood myths. We're about to uncover the world that gave us our first cities, the world that invented bureaucracy and complex administration, the world where the foundations of our modern lives were being quietly laid thousands of years ago. This isn't just a story about forgotten kings and dusty ruins. This is the story of civilization itself, and it all begins not with a sword, but with a spreadsheet. First things first, we need to dismantle the myth of the landscape itself. In the movies, Mesopotamia is just a generic backdrop, a vast, sun-scorched desert where nothing could possibly grow except conflict. It's treated like a stage for human drama, not the driving force behind it. This could not be more wrong. The land wasn't the stage, it was the main character. The real story starts with two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. In fact, the name Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. This region, part of the larger Fertile Crescent, was anything but a barren wasteland. These rivers created an incredibly fertile plain by depositing rich silt from the mountains every single year. This soil was a gift, capable of producing agricultural surpluses that were unimaginable anywhere else on Earth at the time. But this gift came with a terrifying catch. Unlike the predictable, gentle flooding of Egypt's Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates were violent, chaotic, and completely unpredictable. They could swell into a raging, destructive torrent one year, wiping out entire villages, and then deliver barely enough water the next, threatening widespread famine. This brutal reality became the catalyst for one of the greatest leaps in human history. Survival here wasn't possible for lone individuals or small family groups. To tame these rivers, to dig irrigation canals that would carry water to the fields during droughts, and to build dikes to protect against catastrophic floods, required something entirely new. It required mass cooperation. It required planning, coordination, and shared labor on a scale never seen before. This is where the first seeds of civilization were truly sown. People were forced to come together, organize, and work for a common goal. And out of this shared struggle against the chaos of nature, the first permanent settlements began to grow into something the world had never witnessed: the city. The pioneers in this new world were the Sumerians, who settled in southern Mesopotamia, with their culture flourishing around 4500 BCE. They were the first to truly master this challenging environment. They built the world's first complex irrigation networks, turning the unpredictable floodplains into a breadbasket. In doing so, they created the world's first great cities, like Eridu, Ur, and the legendary Uruk. These weren't just overgrown villages. They were sprawling urban centers with tens of thousands of people, monumental architecture, and a level of social organization that was revolutionary. The land didn't just allow for civilization, it demanded it. And the Sumerians answered the call. Hollywood's other favorite trope? Constant, chaotic warfare. Life in Mesopotamia is shown as a brutal free-for-all where kings are just glorified warlords. And while war was definitely a part of their world, Focusing on it means you miss the most radical innovation of the era. The biggest challenge for the first city dwellers wasn't the enemy at the gates. It was the overwhelming complexity of life within the walls. Picture the city of Uruk around 3000 BCE, home to maybe 50,000 people. That's 50,000 people who need to be fed, housed, and organized. The city's granaries stored immense quantities of grain. Its workshops churned out pottery, textiles, and tools. Its temples owned vast tracts of land and huge herds of livestock. How do you keep track of all that? How do you know how much grain is in the storehouse? How many sheep does the temple of Inanna own? How much barley is owed to a worker for their daily wage? Human memory just can't handle that kind of data. A verbal agreement can be forgotten or disputed. As society got bigger, it needed a new tool to manage this explosion of information. And so, the Mesopotamians invented something far more powerful than the sharpest sword: writing. The world's first writing system, cuneiform, wasn't born from a desire to write epic poetry or preserve the deeds of kings. It was invented for accounting. It was created by temple administrators, the world's first bureaucrats, to keep records. The earliest cuneiform tablets aren't tales of heroic battles. They're receipts, they're lists of goods, they're ration allocations. Seriously, one of the oldest tablets ever found is a receipt for beer. And this is profoundly important. It tells us that the driving force behind this world-changing invention was the simple need for organization. Cuneiform started as simple pictures or pictographs scratched into wet clay. A picture of a barley stalk meant barley. A drawing of an ox's head meant ox. But this was slow. Over centuries, these pictures became more abstract, streamlined into the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. It evolved from a system for counting stuff into a sophisticated script that could capture the sounds of spoken language, allowing for complex ideas, laws, letters, and eventually literature. But at its heart, it was the tool of the administrator. And the person who wielded this tool, the scribe, was one of the most respected figures in society. Becoming a scribe meant years of grueling education in a school called the Aduba, or tablet house. Students, almost always the sons of the elite, would spend their days from sunrise to sunset learning hundreds of cuneiform signs and mastering mathematics. A popular Sumerian proverb went, "He who would excel in the school of the scribes must rise with the sun." These scribes were the engine of the state. They were the civil service, the accountants, the lawyers. They managed the vast economic empires of the temple and the palace, the two central institutions of any Mesopotamian city. These two powers were deeply intertwined, creating a complex system of governance held together by clay tablets and the people who could read them. So, while the warrior was a figure of prestige, it was the bureaucrat who actually made the city work. The real revolution of Mesopotamia wasn't military, it was administrative. They didn't just build cities, they invented the systems needed to run them. If you're as fascinated by the real story of Mesopotamia as I am, take a second to subscribe. We're all about digging past the myths to find the truth, and every subscriber helps us keep digging. All right, let's get back to it. The Hollywood king of Mesopotamia is a trope we all know. A bearded, muscle-bound despot who rules with an iron fist and a short temper. His word is law, and his punishments are swift and brutal. This image is largely based on figures like the Assyrian king Ashur-nasirpal II, who loved to brag about his cruelty. And while kings like him definitely existed, painting all Mesopotamian rulers with that brush ignores their most profound contribution to civilization: written law. The reality is that for most of Mesopotamian history, kings were not seen as being above the law. They were its chief enforcers, appointed by the gods to bring justice and order to the land. The king's primary duty was to be the shepherd of his people, protecting the weak from the strong and ensuring society ran fairly. And the ultimate expression of this duty was creating law codes. Long before the famous Code of Hammurabi, rulers were putting their laws in writing. One of the earliest examples comes from a ruler named Urukagina of Lagash, around 2400 BCE. He issued a series of reforms, claiming he was chosen by his god to end the abuses of corrupt officials, protecting widows and orphans, so the powerful couldn't exploit the poor. But the pinnacle of this tradition is the Code of Hammurabi of Babylon, from around 1750 BCE. It's not the first law code, but it's the most magnificent and complete one we have. It was carved onto a massive stone pillar, nearly 7.5 feet tall, for everyone to see. At the very top, a carving shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the god of justice. The message is crystal clear. These aren't the random whims of a man. These laws are divine, eternal, and unchanging. Now everyone knows the most famous principle from this code: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And this has been used to paint Babylonian justice as uniquely brutal. But that's a total misreading of its purpose. First, this principle of retaliation only applied to social equals. Punishments were scaled according to social class. A nobleman who blinded a commoner would just pay a fine, not lose his own eye. It reveals a deeply stratified society, sure, but a society with rules. More importantly, the vast majority of the 282 laws in Hammurabi's code have nothing to do with violent revenge. They are a blueprint for a complex urban society. They deal with contract disputes, property rights, inheritance, and family law. There are laws about renting oxen, the wages for boatmen, and the liability of a builder if a house he builds collapses. Law 229 states, if a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls in and kills its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. It sounds harsh, but it's a law about professional responsibility and consumer protection. There are laws about irrigation, a life and death matter. Law 55 says, if a man opens his irrigation canal to let in water, but is careless, and the water floods his neighbor's field, he shall pay his neighbor grain for his loss. This isn't tyranny. It's smart administration designed to stop the everyday disputes that can tear a society apart. By putting laws in writing and displaying them publicly, rulers like Hammurabi were binding themselves. They were creating a standard against which their own actions could be judged. They were establishing the principle that society should be governed by laws, not by the arbitrary whims of men. And that is one of the greatest gifts Mesopotamia ever gave the world. In movies, Mesopotamian religion is usually a Hollywood horror show. Shadowy priests in ziggurats, performing bizarre, bloody rituals to terrifying golden idols. It's a vision fueled by a complete misunderstanding of their worldview. Religion, in Mesopotamia, wasn't some fringe activity. It was the very fabric of existence, woven into every part of daily life. Their world was filled with divine forces, and their goal wasn't to cower in fear, but to live in harmony with them, their gods. And goddesses were powerful, immortal, and often terrifyingly human. They could be jealous, angry, and unpredictable, a lot like the rivers that shaped their lives. Gods like Anu, the sky god, Enlil, the god of storms, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war, had to be constantly appeased with rituals and offerings to keep the cosmos in balance. The ziggurat, that iconic step tower, wasn't a place of human sacrifice. It was a man-made mountain, a symbolic stairway connecting Earth to the heavens, the earthly home of the city's patron god. But where Hollywood really gets it wrong is with demons. Take Pazuzu. Thanks to the movie The Exorcist, Pazuzu is now a global symbol of evil. The movie shows him as a monster that possesses a little girl. The historical reality is the exact opposite. Pazuzu, with his terrifying face and wings, was actually a protective spirit. He was the king of the wind demons, and his power was mostly used to ward off an even more sinister goddess named Lamashtu, who was believed to snatch newborn infants. People wore amulets with Pazuzu's face not to invite evil in, but to guard their families against it. Hollywood took a guardian and turned him into the monster he was supposed to fight. This points to a bigger truth. Magic and rituals were their practical technology for dealing with a dangerous world. They used incantations to fight sickness and divination, like reading sheep's livers, to try and understand the will of the gods. This wasn't evil superstition. It was their science and medicine, an attempt to bring order to a chaotic universe. Their view of the afterlife was pretty bleak, a gloomy underworld called the Land of No Return, where the dead ate dust and clay. Maybe because of this, they put a huge emphasis on family in this life. Most people weren't buried in great tombs, but under the floors of their own houses, keeping the ancestors close and making the family home a nexus for both the living and the dead. And the cultural influence of these beliefs is staggering. Many of the foundational stories of Western civilization got their start here. The most famous example is the Great Flood, a story told in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh centuries before it appears in the Bible as the story of Noah's Ark. The biggest questions about humanity's creation, our relationship with the gods, and our search for meaning were first explored on clay tablets between the Tigris and Euphrates. Maybe the most damaging myth is the simplest one, that Mesopotamian society was primitive. The stereotype is of people in crude mud huts, their lives a monotonous cycle of back-breaking labor. This picture is a gross injustice to a civilization. That was actually a hotbed of explosive innovation. Let's step inside a typical Babylonian home. Forget the mud hut. A normal city dweller lived in a well-built two-story house made of sun-dried bricks, centered around a courtyard that provided light and air, a design still used in the Middle East today. Society wasn't just kings and peasants. There was a large and dynamic middle class of merchants, artisans, and skilled professionals. And what about Mesopotamian women? While the society was patriarchal, women had rights that were unheard of in many other ancient cultures. A woman could own property, run a business, make contracts, and serve as a witness in court. The most stunning example is Enheduanna. Around 2300 BCE, she was the high priestess of the moon god in the city of Ur. But Enheduanna was also a poet. She composed hymns and poems that were signed with her name, making her the very first author in all of human history that we know by name. The world's first literary giant was a woman, and life wasn't all work. Archaeologists have found kids' toys, dolls, toy chariots, and pull toys with wheels. They found board games like the Royal Game of Ur. Adults enjoyed sports like wrestling and boxing, and music was everywhere with lyres, harps, and flutes. But The real genius of Mesopotamia lies in the inventions we still use every single day. Let's talk about math. They developed a base 60 system, and while we live in a base 10 world, you use their system constantly. The 60 seconds in a minute, the 60 minutes in an hour, that's them. The 360 degrees in a circle, that's them too. The priests who stood on the ziggurats were also the world's first real astronomers. They meticulously recorded the movements of the planets and mapped the stars into the first constellations, creating the zodiac. They could even predict eclipses with astonishing accuracy. This was crucial for farming, and it was the foundation of all future astronomy. Their tech legacy is just as huge. They are credited with inventing the wheel, first for pottery and then for chariots. They invented the sail, revolutionizing trade on their rivers. They mastered metallurgy, moving humanity from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age. They even invented glassmaking. This was not a primitive society. This was a civilization crackling with intellectual energy, a culture of innovators who laid the foundations of science, technology, and urban life. Finally, popular culture treats Mesopotamia as if it were one single, unchanging empire that lasted for 3,000 years. That's like talking about European history as if the Roman Empire, medieval France, and Victorian England were all the same thing. The reality is that Mesopotamia was a vibrant, dynamic, and often violent patchwork of competing city-states and successive empires. It was a mosaic of different peoples, each building on the achievements of the last. The story starts with the Sumerians in the south. They were the great innovators. They gave us the first cities, writing, and irrigation. They set the template. Then came the Akkadians. Under their king, Sargon the Great, around 2334 BCE, they conquered the Sumerian cities and created the world's first empire. They adopted and spread Sumerian culture, adding a new layer of centralized authority. After them, the next great power to rise was Babylon. Under its most famous king, Hammurabi, Babylon became the cultural center of the region. The Babylonians were the great scholars and lawmakers. They gave us Hammurabi's code and made incredible advances in math and astronomy. Finally, in the north, rose the Assyrians. The Assyrians were masters of military tech and the ones who really fit that brutal warrior stereotype. But that's only half their story. The last great Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, created a magnificent library in his capital, Nineveh. He sent scribes everywhere to collect and copy every text they could find. Myths, scientific works, history, everything. It's because his library was preserved, ironically when his enemies burned the city, that we know so much about the thousands of years of Mesopotamian history that came before him: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian. It was a relay race of civilization, where the baton of knowledge was passed from one culture to the next for 3 millennia. So, the next time you see ancient Mesopotamia on screen as just a generic backdrop of sand and swords, remember the truth. Remember the meticulous administrators who invented writing to track rations of beer. Remember the lawmakers who tried to build a just society with rules for everything from collapsed buildings to stray oxen. Remember the families living in 2-story houses whose kids played with board games. Remember the astronomers who mapped the stars and gave us the 60-second minute. Remember Enheduanna, the world's first named author. And remember Pazuzu, the terrifying demon who was actually a guardian, a perfect symbol of how easily the real story can be twisted into a myth. The Hollywood version is simple, but the real story is profound. It's the story of how we, as a species, first figured out how to live together in massive numbers. The challenges they faced, managing resources, creating social order, dealing with environmental change, are still the challenges we face today. Our world, in 1,000 unseen ways, was built on a Mesopotamian foundation. Their story isn't some foreign epic. It's the first chapter of our own. Thanks for watching. What Mesopotamian myth were you most surprised to see debunked? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more journeys into our shared past. Until next time.